Well, this is a first for me. I don't recall ever recording a video lecture for a Bible class, so I hope this goes well. There will be kind of a learning curve, I think, here as I learn how to do all of this and hopefully get a little bit better at it as I do more and more of it. But hopefully, we won't have to do too much of this. Hopefully, the flu will be decreasing in its effects and in its spread in just a few weeks, and we'll all be able to get back together again for our regular meetings, which, of course, is what we like and enjoy the most. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everybody is taking all of the necessary precautions that you need to take and keeping yourself safe as you possibly can. If you are looking at this video, you have obviously found it on the church website. If there are others in the group who are having difficulty finding it, you may want to uh, text them or call them and help them navigate their way through the site to the video. And of course, this is no substitute for what we normally do, but hopefully the videos that Jared and I will post here over the next few weeks will help in some way to help us continue to feed on the Word of God as we think about the Gospel of John or the study of the Kings or whatever it is, so that we won't just have nothing for the few weeks that we're apart from each other. So I hope that this video is helpful, and we will continue on with our study in the Gospel of John. We're going to pick up in John chapter 17 and around verse 22. We had been looking at verses 20 and 21 when we left off last time, where Jesus said, I do not ask on behalf of these alone, but for those also who believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, even as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you sent me. We were noticing a little bit of what may be involved in this prayer for unity. Jesus, of course, says here that he prays for those who would believe based on the word of the apostles, and that all those who believe, whether they are those men or later disciples like ourselves, would be one. But Jesus doesn't say here in this little prayer what that oneness consists of. And so we were talking in class last time as to what some of the dimensions of this unity might be. It is not just, of course, a unity of doctrine, although being on the same page doctrinally is, of course, important in the New Testament, that we believe the truth about things as God has revealed them. And so, yes, all having the same beliefs about Jesus and who he is part of this. But it seems that there is more to it than that love is somewhere in this equation as well. Now, love would be part of this unity. And again, I don't think it would be all of it. It would be a piece of the equation. But I think even beyond love, there is something like a unity of mind or heart or purpose, a unity of work. For Jesus, of course, he says here that he wanted the kind of oneness that existed between him and the Father. And of course, on Jesus' side, that meant a commitment to the Father. And on the side of God, that meant that God shared all things with Jesus. And so this kind of translates, I think, into our work together and our unity as we think about sharing with one another, as we are committed to one another, that we dwell together in unity in these kinds of ways. It is an inward kind of bond that Jesus is talking about here, and ultimately it would be based on the disciples' common submission to the Word of God. And all of this, Jesus says, would produce a kind of evidence for the world to see that Jesus really had been sent from the Father. In other words, our behavior, our unity, would be a kind of testimony about Jesus because the behavior of the disciples says something about the Master himself. So this unity that Jesus is praying for his disciples, is nothing like that produced by the world. The world is going to look at this and say, that is really something. That is different. We don't know that kind of unity in anything that we do. It's something that exists only among Christians. And of course, our goal is constantly that we will attain to that kind of unity to the very best that we can in our local church. But Jesus goes on, and this is where we left off last time, picking up at verse 22. He continues to pray, "The glory, Father, which you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one just as we are one. I in them, and you in me, that they may be perfected in unity, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them, even as you have loved me. Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, be with me where I am, so that they may see my glory, which you have given me, for you loved me before the foundation of the world." Here Jesus connects this unity now with the glory that he has, that has been his from the beginning, which he has shared with the Father. And one of the reasons that disciples can attain to this unity, according to this prayer, is because Jesus has imparted something of himself to his disciples. And here he says it is his glory. This, of course, is kind of a difficult statement. In what sense has Jesus committed his glory to them? They certainly haven't been glorified in the normal sense of that word, that they have been transformed and now live in heavenly bodies in a heavenly realm, or that kind of thing. And so we have to, of course, understand what Jesus is trying to get at as best we can here. The word glory is one of those words in the Bible that the Bible never really defines it, but the word is something like the manifestation of God's character or person. It is used in context where there is a revealing of who God is, that God is regularly declared to be existing in glory. Now, we may certainly think about the majesty and the brilliance of God's presence, and there are scenes in the Bible where Bible writers attempt to describe what it was like to look on God's visible presence as much as they could see it. But you may recall from some other things we've said in our study of the Gospel of John that in the Gospel of John, God's glory is ultimately God's love. That God is glorified by the death of the Son. That the glory of God, the greatness, the majesty, the splendor of God is never more clearly seen than when we are watching God act in love for us. It is his love that is glorious. Now, that's not to say that that's the only thing that God's glory consists of. Certainly, everything about God is glorious. But for John's purposes, John wants us to understand that God's love is part of God's glory, ultimately his love for man. And so when we hear this kind of thing, we understand that God's glory and God's love are very, very closely related, that they are almost in a sense, two sides of the same coin. And yet that love does not exhaust God's glory. And it does not exhaust the glory of Jesus, because Jesus here talks about the disciples coming to be with him where he will be, so that they may see my glory, the glory that he had with the Father before the foundation of the world. And ultimately, I think that these two things are related. That it is people of love who will be glorified forever. To be a person of love is to be a person who lives in the glory of God, who has taken on himself the glory of God, the majesty and the greatness of God. In this sense, we can be something like God in that we share in his glory, that is, in his love. And the perfection of that glory will exist, of course, in heaven. So the disciples themselves will enter into glory as they exhibit divine love in their own lives, a love that is ultimately taught and demonstrated by Jesus himself. And I think that's what he's getting at when he says here in verse 22, the glory which you have given me, I have given to them. That he has left them an example of love, of sacrifice, of giving everything for them. That is what he has imparted to them. That is the glory that he has shared with them. And as they live those lives, they too will enter into glory. Jesus brings the prayer to a close then in verses 25 and 26. He says, O righteous Father, although the world has not known you, yet I have known you, and these have known that you sent me. And I have made your name known to them, and will make it known, so that the love with which you loved me may be in them, and I in them. So here we have Jesus kind of wrapping up the threads that he has been touching on in this prayer. These disciples are not like the world. The world has not known the Father. We've seen that over and over throughout the story that John has told us, that even Jesus' own people are of the world. They do not see, they do not understand, because their eyes are willfully blinded. They don't want to know the truth. But these men are different. They have at least been willing to see, willing to listen, to understand who Jesus is. And that doesn't mean that at this point in the story that they understand it perfectly, that they know all there is to know about Jesus. They're certainly going to be surprised by the events that are going to unfold here in the next couple chapters. We all know that story. And so Jesus is not saying that these disciples have reached some kind of perfection. But he is saying that because they have known Jesus, they have now come to know the Father. Like Jesus said in John 14, that if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. And so Jesus has made the Father known to them through himself. They have come to believe that he is sent from God. And again, that doesn't mean that they understand that perfectly, but they do believe that. And Jesus has shown God's name to them. That is, that he has shown God's essence, the nature of God. Ultimately, the crowning characteristic of that, of course, again, is love. Because Jesus says that since I have made your name known to them, that the love that you have loved me will then be in them. That they will come to see this love. They will themselves become people of love, and they will live that way in the footsteps of Jesus. And Jesus says here that not only have I made your name known to them by the signs and the things that he has said and done already, but I will make it known. And the ultimate demonstration of God's glory and love will, of course, be on the cross. That brings us then to chapter 18. And starting in chapter 18, we enter into John's description of the passion or the death and resurrection of Jesus. Most people are familiar with the story of the death, burial, and resurrection as told by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, however, tells the story in a little bit different way. Now, that doesn't mean that he's telling us a different story or that there are contradictions. We have to remember that we have four gospels here. And it's like, watching an automobile accident. Four people will see the same accident. And yet, when they report to the police officer what they saw, some will have seen one thing, some will not have noticed another thing. Some people will be particularly impressed by a certain part of the scene that they saw, and they will emphasize that, and others will emphasize other things. And so it is with the telling of the story of Jesus, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not just simply all trying to tell us the same thing. We would only need one gospel if that were the case. But there are different emphases in these stories, different things to take away. It doesn't mean that the other parts that are told by the other witnesses or the other gospels are untrue or contradictory or unimportant or anything like that. It simply means that there are things that John wanted to emphasize as he told this story. So, with that in mind, there are a few things about the way John tells the story of the arrest and trial and death and resurrection of Jesus that may strike you a little bit different or strange if you're used to the account in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For example, we know from the Synoptic Gospels that Jesus had a trial before the Jewish Sanhedrin, and that once they condemned him, they then sent him to Pilate. John tells us nothing about the trial that Jesus had before the Jewish council. Now, he does have a story here about an interview that Jesus has with one of the Jewish leaders named Annas, who was a former high priest, still alive at the time of Jesus. We are told in chapter 18 and verse, let's see here, 13, that Annas is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who is the high priest that year. So Annas is apparently a former high priest who retains the title, kind of like a president, is still called Mr. President even when he's out of office. And he has this interview with Jesus, but John does not tell us the trial that Jesus had before the Jews. Only this pre-trial kind of interview. So it's kind of interesting from that point of view. Also, and this I think is even more significant, we are familiar from the other Gospels with the fact, of course, that Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the other Gospels tell us that the chief priests and their police force came to the garden, and there Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss, and Jesus was arrested. John alone tells us that Romans were part of the force that arrested Jesus. And in chapter 18 and verse 3, you'll notice that they are mentioned first. That Judas, having received the Roman cohort, and then the officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees are mentioned afterwards. John's the only gospel writer that mentions that Romans are here, and that is significant because I think this is part of a reflection of the worldview that John the Apostle had as he wrote this gospel somewhere near the end of the first century. The book of Revelation was written somewhere around 95 and 96, and most scholars believe that the Gospel of John would have been written before that time, that you have to know the terminology and that kind of thing from the Gospel of John in order to make sense of the book of Revelation. So the Gospel came first. How much earlier it was written than the book of Revelation is hard to say, but late 80s, early 90s might not be a bad guess for the date of the Gospel of John. Now, of course, if you've ever read the book of Revelation, John there warned the Christians at the end of the first century about horrible conflict that was coming, that Satan was going to use the Roman Empire and the imperial cult as a tool to attack God's people and try to destroy them. And John vividly portrays Rome in the book of Revelation as the enemy of the Lamb and of the Lamb's people. You see that same kind of perspective here in the Gospel of John. Whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke emphasize the Jewish rejection of Jesus, John emphasizes the Roman role in it. For John, it is the Romans who killed Jesus. Now, that's not to say that the Jews had no part in it, had no hand in it. We heard as far back as chapter 12, remember that Caiaphas, the high priest, had told his colleagues, chapter 11, he told his colleagues that we've got to kill Jesus. If we don't, everybody will follow him. The Romans will come and kill everybody. We've got to save the nation by killing Jesus. And of course, he didn't realize the ultimate truth of that prophecy. So, yes, the Jews do have a hand in the death of Jesus in the Gospel of John. But that's not what John wants to emphasize. John wants to emphasize the Roman role in the death of Jesus. They are here, of course, in verse 3. But in John's telling of the story, the guilt of the Jews has already been established. You remember back in chapter 12, verses 37 through 43, we had that little summary at the end of the ministry of Jesus, where John said it was just like Isaiah said, that nobody would listen, that their eyes were blind, and nobody would admit to what they might have even thought about Jesus because everybody was kind of closed to Jesus. So the Jewish guilt has already been established in this gospel. John doesn't need to do that, but he does want to show that the Romans played a key part in the death of Jesus, and that they may be viewed not only as the people who killed Jesus, but they must be understood also as the people who are the enemies of the people of Jesus. There are some other things in the way John tells the story that we will notice as we go through the first part of this chapter, but just kind of keep your eyes open to some things that may be different from the way that you're used to hearing it from the synoptics. So to pick up in chapter 18 and verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden, in which he entered with his disciples. Now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So the Last Supper and the farewell discourse, chapters 13 through 17, took place somewhere inside the old city of Jerusalem. We saw at one point in the narrative, at the end of chapter 14, that Jesus had said, "Get up, let us go from here." And so, did they walk for a while through the city on their way to Gethsemane? Did they stop at some point and Jesus prayed? Chapter 17. Those are probably the kinds of things that we have to imagine as we're reading this text. But in verse 18, we're now very close. We're close to the Garden of Gethsemane, and they're still on the Jerusalem side of the area there. If you may remember, if you want to look at a Bible map in your Bible, the city of Jerusalem has a valley that runs north and south through it, the Kidron Valley, and it separates the city mount from the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is to the east, the city is to the west of the valley, with the valley running north and south. So here they leave the city, cross over the Kidron Valley and the Kidron Brook there, to the western slope of the Mount of Olives. Now, we don't know exactly where Jesus met with his disciples here and the spot where he was arrested. There is a place in Jerusalem today called the Church of All Nations that has a stand of very old olive trees, and they claim that it is the spot where Jesus would have been arrested, but we just don't know for sure. That particular site is very close to another site where it is believed that Jesus may have been held in custody and where the high priest's house was. It may have been near there, but it may have been further north up the valley. We just don't know for sure the spot along that side of the Mount of Olives where the Garden of Gethsemane was. It really doesn't matter, to know the exact spot, but just to know kind of the idea of what's going on here. Notice it says here, that they went to a garden. And I've mentioned this before, but remember, a garden in the Bible is not a place where plants and flowers grow. It's a place where trees grow. It's what we would call a park or a grove. So it's a place where there is a stand of trees along the side of the Mount of Olives. And very importantly, we're told in verse 2 that Jesus went to a spot that Judas knew. We are told in the Gospel of Luke that during this last week of Jesus' life, that he used to spend the evenings on the Mount of Olives. And so this may have been a place where the men had slept during the night, even during that week. But Jesus, of course, had been in Jerusalem many times before this. And so John wants us to understand this is the spot that they always use. This is the place they always went. Judas would have known exactly where it was. The crowded city, of course, remember that the city is filled with visitors because this is the Passover. Every house was full, every room was full, upper rooms were full. And imagine now Judas has to lead these people, the Roman soldiers and the Jewish contingent as well, to arrest Jesus. Well, maybe you've thought about this, but that would have presented a little bit of a difficulty. I mean, if we have here a Roman cohort, and technically a Roman cohort is as much as 600 men, I don't know if that's how many they have on this occasion or not, but using Roman soldiers marching through the streets of the old city looking for Jesus, I mean, a lot of people would have resented this. This is the kind of thing that could have started a riot. This is the kind of thing that many Jews thought, well, if we're going to have a war on the eve of Passover here and get our independence again, the Romans are picking a fight here. So the picture that seems to develop from John chapter 18 is that Jesus is orchestrating his own arrest. And rather than stay in the city where it would have caused trouble and there would have been fighting and Roman soldiers and people, gathering around and commotion and all of those things, Jesus, of course, didn't want any of that to happen. And so he goes to a place where there won't be a public confrontation, a place that Judas will know exactly where to find Jesus and where Jesus can be arrested without causing a riot or starting a war. Jesus is orchestrating the events of this night, and he is doing so that it will go smoothly. He's not going to leave this to chance. He's not going to leave it to the multitudes to behave properly. He's going to make sure that God's will is done. There's something interesting also going on if we notice the wording of the text here. It says in verse 1 that he entered the garden, and then in verse 4, he exited or went forth. And so the picture seems to be that this is a defined spot. Some scholars have even suggested that it may have had a little wall around it. And whether that is true or not, the idea of kind of a known, enclosed, defined spot is very reminiscent of John chapter 10, where Jesus spoke of being the good shepherd and how the sheep know his voice and how they enter into the sheepfold through him. You remember back there in John chapter 10, he says that he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep but climbs up some other way is a thief and robber, but he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. And so this idea of the sheepfold and Jesus with the Father's sheep, and he is the shepherd over the Father's sheep, it kind of plays out in the story here in John 18 that they're together in a place where you can go in and out of in some sense, that they are the sheep and Jesus has shepherded them to this place. Also interesting is, as we mentioned here in verse 1, we're told that they crossed the Kidron to the Mount of Olives where there was a garden. And then in chapter 19 and verse 41, as the story is coming to a close, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and it is in this garden where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. And the point we wish to make is simply that if you'll notice, that the story of the death and resurrection begins and ends with references to a garden. And that, it seems to me, is significant. It's not just the coincidence that there was a garden here at Gethsemane, and there happened to be another place of trees over there by the place where Jesus died. No, no. Garden in the Bible is a specific reference. That the Garden of Eden is probably in view. And we have all of that imagery that is kind of therefore coming back into this. You remember John chapter 1, where we were told that the world had become dark again, and God said, as it were, let there be light. He sent Jesus into the world, starting a new creation, starting the world all over again with the work of Jesus Christ. Well, you see that kind of here as well with this reference to the garden, that we're back to a garden now. And it is by the death of Jesus, the arrest and death of Jesus and resurrection, all connected with a garden, that this new creation, that this changing, that this transforming and renewing of everything will take place. And it further suggests that Jesus is the new Adam in the new garden, in the new creation. Well, as we noted in verse 3, Judas then shows up. He has come to the place where he knows Jesus will be. And again, remember, the Romans are mentioned in the Gospel of John here. Very, very important. They come with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Obviously, they are expecting a fight. You remember what Caiaphas said back in chapter 11, that this thing's going to start a war. And we've said before in other classes that the tensions are high, especially during the Passover, but there's this kind of messianic fever in the air in the time of Jesus. Is the Messiah going to show up? Will he start a war with the Romans? Will he liberate the Jews? Will he get us our land back? Will he clear the temple and cleanse everything? And some people have begun to think, according to John, maybe Jesus is going to do that. Maybe Jesus is the Messianic king. Maybe Jesus is going to start a war. Certainly seems that the disciples here in a moment think that way. And so the Romans, they're expecting a fight. But as is common in the Gospel of John, what people expect is usually wrong, and what happens is unexpected. So Judas comes up, and then John says in verse 4, now I want you to remember, Jesus, knowing all things that were coming upon him, went forth. I find this an amazing statement. You know, sometimes we talk about God's will being done in our lives, and we pray, thy will be done. And it's perfectly good that we do so, to pray that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and that we be the people that God uses to do his will. But if you're like me, you probably usually are thinking, well, I'm available, God. I'm going to let you do your will through me. Of course, I don't know exactly what God's plan for me is in the future, but hopefully, as a good disciple of Jesus, I'm willing to go along with whatever reveals itself in the days ahead. But that's not the case with Jesus. It's not like Jesus didn't know what was going to happen, and that he just said, well, Father, I'm ready, let it happen to me. No, Jesus knew exactly what had to happen. He knew the Father's will in detail. And he doesn't wait for it to happen to him. He does what it takes to make it happen. And that's what John is telling us here in verse 4. That Jesus now knew exactly what the consequence would be when he went out from the presence of his disciples here and went to meet the crowd that was coming to him. He knew exactly what this was going to entail and the consequences of it. And not only did he accept it, he made it happen in an even greater acceptance of the will of God for him. So Jesus says to them, "Who are you looking for? Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus the Nazarene." I'm not sure exactly if I can picture in my mind's eye the scene here. I don't know if these people are lost, if they don't know exactly where to go, if Judas, is having trouble finding the place at night or something like that. But Jesus obviously hears them and sees them coming from a distance. And my impression is that he kind of hollers out, "Who are you looking for?" And a voice comes back, "We're looking for Jesus the Nazarene." And Jesus says, "Right here, over here, I'm here." And it says in verse 5 that Judas, who was betraying him, was standing with them. Not standing with Jesus, but standing with them. But there's something else about this verse that is, I think, just tremendously significant. When Jesus said to them, the New American Standard Bible that I'm reading from, his response is, "I am he." But in the original Greek, it is, "I am." Now, the Greek words that are recorded of Jesus here can mean, "I am the one," "I am he," but it also means simply, "I am." And we've seen this before in the Gospel of John, back in chapter 4, when Jesus was talking with the Samaritan woman. "The one who is speaking with you, I am." He said that "I am" to her. In chapter 6, Jesus used these words as he approached the disciples at the storm on the Sea of Galilee. And then 3 times in chapter 8, verse 24, verse 28, and again in verse 58, Jesus says, "I am." And the last time he says it, there in verse 58, the Jews picked up stones to stone him. They knew exactly what he meant by this. They considered it blasphemy. Well, that's the same phrase Jesus uses here in John 18 and verse 5. "I am." And if we think about the ramifications, of course, Jesus is God in the flesh. He is equal to the Father. He can say, "I am," just like the Father can say, "I am." But this is the one who is now about to be arrested and go to the cross. The great I am is going to give himself into the hands of his enemies, and they will do their worst, and they will crucify him. It is a fascinating scene in the account of John to have Jesus say, "I am," and to initiate these proceedings, to initiate the events that cause his death with these words. I think it's amazing. Well, in verse 6 and 7, when they heard Jesus say this, it says they drew back and fell to the ground. It's kind of like it knocked them over. That they cannot get over that if this is really Jesus, or why would he be identifying himself? Why would he say, "I'm over here"? Wouldn't he want to run? Wouldn't he want to hide? But not so. And it is so shocking to them, so unexpected. It's almost as if they stumble and fall down here at what they have just heard. And so Jesus, of course, is not going to wait for them to figure it out. So he says in verse 7 again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus the Nazarene." And Jesus answered, "I told you again, I am. I am he. So if you seek me, let these go their way." And John tells us that he gave them this direction in order to fulfill the word which he spoke. "Of those whom you have given me, I lost not one." That's something that Jesus had prayed back in chapter 17 and verse 12. So Jesus protects his disciples to fulfill the pledge that he made to the Lord. His will be the only life taken among them. There's something missing, though, in this account. Maybe you've seen it. In Matthew and Luke, I can't remember if Mark has or not, but in the Synoptic Gospels, we have Jesus betrayed by Judas with a kiss. That Jesus is there, Judas comes up to him and kisses him on the cheek, and this is the signal. That's not in the Gospel of John. Did that event happen? Well, surely it did, but John doesn't want to emphasize that. Why? Because the emphasis in John's account is on the determination of Jesus. And yes, Judas kissed Jesus on the cheek. That was part of this. We can easily imagine how that fits into the scene that John talks about here. It's not a problem or anything like that. But John says, you know what? I'm not even going to tell you about that, because what I want you to see is that Jesus was in control of this situation. And yes, Judas had a little part in it, but I don't want you to get the impression that somehow Judas caused this, because that's not what happened. Jesus made this happen. Jesus is the one who brought these people to himself. Well, you remember in chapter 18 here, verses 10 and 11, that Peter has a different plan. And we are told that Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. So Peter wants to fight. He sees what's happening. He sees that Jesus is being taken into custody. That doesn't mean that Peter understands what's about to happen, that he really knows that Jesus is about to be, none of that is clear from this text, but Peter doesn't want Jesus to be harmed. And so he jumps up with a sword, and it looks to me like he tries his best to kill another person here. You think about what is required to cut somebody's ear off with a sword and how you have to swing that sword at them. Peter's trying to cut this guy in two and cuts the guy's ear off. And John says, I can tell you exactly who it was. It was a slave of the high priest. He had been taken, with the detail to go and help that night, and his name was Malchus. And Jesus said to Peter, put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? In other words, Peter, no. I'm going to do this. This is what the Father wants, and I'm going to do it. We're not going to fight it. There's not going to be a war here tonight. I can only imagine what Peter must have thought about this, how confused he must have seemed at the moment. And yet, here's another thing that maybe you've noticed already that's not in John's account. You remember in the other Gospels, we're told that Jesus healed this servant. But that miracle is not reported by John. Why not? Well, because John has carefully selected the miracles that he wants us to see, the 7 signs of the Gospel of John. Now, it doesn't mean that Jesus didn't do other miracles. We know perfectly well that he did. John's going to say that later on in chapter 20, that many other signs Jesus did while he was on the earth in the presence of the disciples. But what John has wanted to do is show us signs that proved that Jesus is the Son of God. Healing Malchus in the garden is not a display of Jesus' deity so much as it is perhaps a display of Jesus' kindness. Now, of course, Jesus has the power of God to do that, obviously. We're not saying it has nothing to do with his deity. But it's not the kind of sign that John wants to emphasize in his telling of the story. So Peter had other plans, obviously, but Jesus will not let them proceed. I think we've kind of gone long enough for the purposes of this video. I don't want to tax your attention too much. So we're going to pick up with chapter 18 and verse 12, where Jesus is taken to be interviewed by the Jewish authorities. I hope that this video has been helpful. I hope it is something of a decent substitute for the Bible class that we normally have. If you have questions about something in the text, email me or get on the group me and ask those questions. I'd be glad to entertain whatever questions you have about this text. If you have comments about it that you'd like to share with the group, get on the Group Me app and share those comments as well. And Lord willing, we'll be back to our face-to-face Bible classes very soon. Thanks for your kind attention.